Hello, it's day 77. You probably, okay, so I'm on page 563. If it jumped ahead in time by a little bit, that's because last time I tried to stream, it didn't really work. But we didn't really cover very much content. We just covered a bunch of pages because we went through a bunch of pictures, which I didn't even talk about or show. So I think it's fine if you're following along. And if you're following along, might I recommend doing the official audiobook because they probably pronounce everything right and don't accidentally skip things. Okay. So we were talking about how the traffic was still kind of bad, even though he made a bunch of roads. Okay, cool. Motorists launching gaily into the lovely new parkway have been appalled to find that not all traffic problems have been solved, the New York Times said. Because everyone wants to see it on certain days and at certain hours, there's a long procession of these eager citizens, enjoying the scenery but not getting anywhere. But, the Times added, the public should be of good cheer. When Mr. Moses has got his parkway hooked up firmly to the remainder of the parkway and has double-decked his Spuyten-Duyvil Bridge, we may look to see the arterial tension on our traffic arteries diminishing considerably. By July 9, 1938, the parkway was all hooked up and the double-decking of the bridge was complete, but the hardening of the arteries continued. Traffic on the bridge had been 10 million cars in 1937. By 1939, it rose to 12 million. By 41, 14 million. It would finally top out at 26 million. In the face of such increases, double-decking a bridge hardly seemed to make any difference at all. Motorists pulling up to pay their tolls found themselves at the ends of lines that seemed little, if any, shorter than the lines had been at the old Broadway Bridge, whose congestion New York had considered intolerable. And there was another puzzling fact. Although the bridge had been built to relieve the congestion on the old bridge, congestion on the old bridge had not been noticeably relieved. The line of cars waiting to cross it was, in fact, almost as long as ever. Oh no. And traffic jams were not restricted to the bridge toll booths or to certain days or certain hours. They extended the length of the West Side Improvement that led to and from the bridge so that sometimes the 3 lanes of the Henry Hudson Parkway and West Side Elevated Highway that carried traffic in the direction of the rush, the southbound lanes into the city in the morning, the northbound lanes out of the city in the evening, were 3 lanes of bumper-to-bumper cars all the way from Canal Street to the city line. The rush hour jams were just as bad as the rush hour jams had been on Riverside Drive before the West Side Improvement was built. Reporters escorted over the West Side Improvement before it opened had found it reduced the time required for the 9-mile trip from 68 minutes to 26. Now, one of those reporters made the trip over the West Side Improvement at 2 rush hours, admittedly very bad ones, and found that on one trip it took 58 minutes, on the other 73. And looking at the situation that way, the total effect on traffic congestion the West Side Improvement had been to move the congestion 1 block west, and yet there was still congestion on Riverside Drive, congestion that had been eased only slightly by the construction of a parallel route. The improvement had simply provided New York with 2 congested thoroughfares where one had existed before, and, of course, had given the motorists using the new congested thoroughfare a nicer view. And in fact, the drivers on the new thoroughfare were hardly in a position to enjoy the view. Following another car bumper to bumper required the focusing of a driver's eyes, not on the Hudson waterfront celebrated by Masefield and O'Neill, or the matchless, unspoiled Palisades, but on a bumper. How about drivers using the Henry Hudson Parkway during off hours? Year by year, the situation would not change until 1956, when the opening of the parallel Major Deegan Expressway and the southward extension of the parallel Bronx River Parkway cut traffic on the Henry Hudson Parkway in half. The number of off hours on the Henry Hudson Parkway grew smaller and smaller. During daylight, in fact, there was hardly any hour in which traffic on the parkway was not generally heavy. Passengers could enjoy the view, of course, but Saturday and Sunday traffic was heaviest of all. That surprises me. What? And there must be some doubt whether many passengers were prepared to enjoy the view for as long as it took, stopping and starting, braking and accelerating, sweating under their car's hot tin roof to negotiate the parkway on those days. The West Side Improvement had two purposes: to reclaim Manhattan's waterfront for its people and to alleviate Manhattan's traffic congestion. It was to achieve these purposes that Robert Moses spent an incredibly large sum of money. But despite that expenditure, all but inconceivable in terms of urban spending of the era, the first of the two purposes was achieved only in part. The West Side Improvement did create a park, but while it was a great park, it was not nearly as great as it could have been. Instead of reclaiming the waterfront for Manhattan's people, the West Side Improvement deprived them all. And the second of the two purposes was not achieved at all. The effect of the West Side Improvement on New York City was not limited to its effect on traffic or on Riverside Park, of course. The improvement extended through several areas north of Riverside Park. North of Riverside Park was Inwood Hill Park. On the afternoon on which the opening ceremonies for the West Side Improvement were held, Bill Exton went back to Inwood Hill Park. Or what was left of Inwood Hill Park, the young reformer was to recall. Even before I got up to the top, it was all changed. There were concrete staircases where there used to be dirt paths, and drinking fountains and a whole drainage system. Cutting down the trees on top had destroyed the natural drainage, you see. So now they were laying a new one. At the top, there had been the wonderful view of the river and the Palisades, and there had been peace in which to enjoy it. Now, he was to recall, and his voice would turn bitter. There was a view, all right, a view of the road, a great roaring concrete gut through the forest. They still call it Inwood Hill, but it wasn't Inwood Hill anymore. Suddenly, Exton recalls, I don't know, I just wanted to get out there. I wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. Turning, he walked back down Inwood Hill, and he never went back again. Years later, Exton would recall that I wished that day that there was a reporter up there with me, someone who would listen to me. I would have given him a little footnote about the Great West Side Improvement. But there were no reporters up on Inwood Hill that day. They were all down at 79th Street Grade Elimination Structure, listening to the speeches. As for something that is kind of fun is that I've been listening to pretty much any New York apartment like that you see a video of. If it has a view of the East River, it always has like the whirring sound of traffic from the highway. I've been paying more attention to it now. I can't remember what video I was looking at, probably some random TikTok. Anyway, as for Spuyten and Duyville and all Riverdale to the north of Inwood Hill, Weinberg had predicted that if the parkway were to run through it without planning and zoning for community growth first, it would be turned from a peaceful, quiet place to live, one that could have absorbed a degree of apartment development while still remaining a quiet place to live, into a formless, shapeless mass of high-rise apartment houses with neither adequate nor convenient shopping, jobs, or recreation facilities for its residents. World War II staved off this outcome for 5 years, but after the war, that's precisely what once beautiful Riverdale became. North of Spuyten and Duyville, at the north end of Riverdale, was Van Cortlandt Park, where once there had been the only freshwater marsh left in New York City. When the Henry Hudson Parkway was finished, the marsh was too. Once botany and biology students by the thousands had come every year to study salamanders and polywogs and flowers and shrubs and insects, and a dozen species of birds who would nest only in a freshwater marsh in their natural habitat. Henceforth, as long as New York City might exist, its botany and biology students would be able to study them only by looking at their pictures in books. Biology and botany teachers wrote letters to the editor. A few were printed. Aside from them, no public notice was taken of the city's loss. If you're just coming, we're talking about how the highway's done, the whole West Side Improvement, but the traffic is still really bad, and there's still some losses that they're not really printing in the papers because everyone got so excited. Also, I was gone all weekend because I was at David's college reunion, and thank you for my shirt. I like it too. And also, I did a stream a couple days ago, but it didn't work, and so there was like a few pages of reading that I missed, but nothing really happened. It was just more talking about how the project of the highway was done, but that things were still not great. It felt like kind of repetitive. Yeah. Robert Moses had spent $109 million of the public's money on the West Side Improvement. Counting the money expended on his advice by other city agencies on the portion of the improvement south of 72nd Street, the improvement had cost the public more than $200 million. But the total cost of the improvement cannot be reckoned merely in dollars. The West Side Improvement also cost the people of New York City their most majestic waterfront, their most majestic forest, a unique residential community, and their last freshwater marsh. When the improvement was finished, all these things were gone forever. Adding them to the cost of the West Side Improvement, one might wonder if the improvement had not cost New York City more than it was worth. Adding them into the cost, one might wonder if the West Side Improvement was really on the total balance sheet an improvement at all. One might wonder if it was not, on balance, a tragic and irremediable loss. But with a few lonely and unheard exceptions, at the time the improvement was built, no one was adding. And then we have a new section. We have one of these little bars that he's been doing a lot this chapter. 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? Robert Moses, Robert Moses, Robert Moses. That's kind of a fun start to the chapter. Little children in New York City. Also, it's funny how cheers like that don't really change over time. Like he'll print the lyrics to Sidewalks of New York, which was Al Smith's song, and it's like I haven't heard of that. Maybe some people have. I haven't. But 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? People have been doing that on playgrounds forever. Anyway. Little children in New York City during the 30s cheered the park commissioner that way, and by parading to 80 Center Street to present him with tokens of their esteem, such as 2 scrapbooks containing the names of thousands of boys and girls from the summer day camps run in his parks by the WPA and the Board of Education. Older children, many of whose high school civics and social studies classrooms were decorated with pictures of his bridges and parks, distributed broad scale by the park department, cheered him at special assemblies at which he received their tributes. The president of the Richmond High School Arista, awarding Commissioner Moses the Honor Society's annual medal, called him the ideal civic leader because he possessed the following qualities: intelligence, efficiency, conviction, personality, culture, incorruptibility, sense of humor, perseverance, foresight, tolerance, knowledgeable, unselfishness, idealism, and modesty. Quite the list. Children off to college took their enthusiasm along. He was voted America's most useful public servant at Manhattan College, the ideal public servant at Fordham University. And the city's children weren't cheering any louder than its adults. Some neighborhoods may have gotten no playgrounds, and others may have not liked the ones they did get. But many neighborhoods were thrilled with theirs and grateful to the man responsible for their creation. The ceremonies opening Greenpoint's McCarran Park, hey, that's one that I've been to, were preceded by a mammoth parade during which bluff old Pete McGinnis, that sounds like such an old, like if you think of like a old school Irish guy, Pete McGinnis, longtime sheriff of Brooklyn and boss of his beloved Greenpoint, is how he pronounced it, insisted that Moses, dressed in the white suit he invariably wore at daytime ceremonies, marched at its head. I still can't figure out how Greenpoint became Greenpoint. Greenpoint. I don't really know what accent must have been happening. I bet the official audiobook maybe has a better version. I don't know. Okay, and when on the speaker's platform afterwards, McGinnis pulled Moses out of his seat, raised both his hands over his head like a boxer's second, raising his hands in a victory gesture, and boomed, "Bob Moses, the champion park commissioner of the world." The crowd was so eager to touch the commissioner that it surged forward against the park's brand new wrought iron fences and knocked them over. That's kind of a fun scene. I'm going to underline that so I remember. Bluff old Pete McGinnis, longtime sheriff of Brooklyn. Some young reformers who had the opportunity to observe Moses' work firsthand had become disturbed by both his policies and practices. But the city's most prestigious good government groups were still dominated by the old line idealists like Richard S. Childs, George McAnany, William J. Schieffelin, and Joseph M. Price, whose first impression of Moses had been of a young idealist, and who felt, in Child's words, that basically he hadn't changed. During the 30s, Moses received many tokens of their tribute. even the gold medal of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, whose leadership had passed out of the hands of the upstaters who had seen Moses trick them out of their control of their beloved state parks, forced them to stop printing their annual report to try to strangle their secretary. Forced them to try to stop printing their annual report and try to strangle their secretary. That's such a funny thing to have just in the list. Okay. I always forget who he tried to strangle. It was the secretary of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. Okay. So highly did the Old Line reformers idolize Moses that they were willing to suffer snubs to be able to present him with an award in person. When he informed the Park Association that he was too busy to take time off for a luncheon at which Mrs. Sulzberger was supposed to present him with the association's testimonial award for most outstanding service to parks, Mrs. Sulzberger and 50 other members of the association trooped off to his office with their illuminated scroll to be rewarded with what one of the 50 recalls an attitude that I can only describe as utter contempt. I really don't have a mental image of this award because it was an illuminated scroll. Like, did they hook up? Was there wiring for the lights to illuminate it? I have really no idea. This is one of the rare times where I just unfortunately need a lot more detail. Okay, illuminated scroll. Joseph M. Price, who had fought so hard for Moses' mayoral candidacy, wow, blast from the past, was reduced to coming to Moses' apartment one evening to present him with the City Club's annual award, a leather-bound, hand-illuminated parchment stating that Moses' achievements constitute the major contribution of our generation to the improvement of the conditions of life in the city. As for businessmen, their admiration for the man whose parkways had boosted real estate values and whose efficiency was giving New York big improvements at small cost was cast in bronze and silver medallions from real estate organizations and Chamber of Commerce and from the 100-Year Association, which is a group of firms and business in the city that long. 3 officers of the Irving Trust Company organized a committee for deserved recognition, whose sole object is to name the West Side Highway and Robert Moses Highway, an object that failed, as attempts to name Jones Beach after its creator had failed, because politicians were afraid that the public would shorten the name to Robert Moses Highway to Moses Highway in usage and would thereby offend the sensibilities of a city's non-Jewish residents. I guess it was the late 30s, and that was chief concern. If Moses' days were white suit days, his evenings were black tie. Ooh la la. The city's hotels should have been grateful during those lean depression years for his popularity. If it would have been difficult selling tickets for a block party honoring Robert Moses in Sunset Park or Harlem or Sprite and Diveville, there was no difficulty in selling tickets to members of those organizations that honored their heroes in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria or the Baroque suite at the Plaza. In fact, when the guest of honor at a formal dinner was the city's park commissioner, a full house could always be expected. His biting ad hominems were worth the price of any ticket, even if they were delivered in a harsh, bored tone by a man who seldom bothered to glance up at his audience. At a dinner celebrating the opening of the $800,000 Hayden Planetarium, Hayden, I forgot how you pronounce it, whose construction was financed by an RFC loan arranged by Moses with great difficulty, and whose star-reproducing dumbbell-shaped projector was purchased with a $160,000 gift from Charles Hayden, who made it to Moses' scorn only on condition that the entire building be named after him. The financier was preening himself on the dais when Moses, rising to speak, turned to him and said, "Charlie, never in the history of philanthropy has anyone earned immortality so cheaply." That's such drama. I'm going to look up who Charlie Hayden is of the planetarium because I just do not know. All right, well, there was one Charlie Hayden who's spelled wrong, who was a jazz double bass player who was born, he would have been like a little child when the planetarium was created. So it must have been named after Charles Hayden, the banker, who's really not well known at all. He only has 314 page views on Wikipedia in a month, which is like just for scale, that's like really low. That's kind of crazy. All right. Yeah, he's just some random guy who's the second paragraph or the second sentence of his Wikipedia says that he named the planetarium. And the Charles Hayden Planetarium at Boston's Museum of Science as well. And also there's a city in Arizona called Hayden, Arizona, because he was instrumental in financing Arizona copper mines and smelters. Okay, cool. Well, nice. That's Charles Hayden. I guess he's kind of irrelevant except for the stuff that bears his name. So maybe he was correct to care so much if he wanted to really be known forever. On one evening, Moses in black tie might be at the Waldorf to be handed a gold medal from the Citizens Union. On another at the Plaza in black tie to be handed another gold medal from the St. Nicholas Society. On still another at the St. Regis to have a gold medallion, 14 karat this time, hung around his neck on a blue and gold moire ribbon by the New York Rotary Club. Then on to Pennsylvania, where the plaque awaiting him was only bronze, but inscribed with a description that Moses thought apt: dreamer, planner, doer. And where the praise heaped on him in front of 1,000 diners was so syrupy that Moses, rising to speak, said he was getting up to try and escape from a Niagara of molasses. Ugh, he's so, heartless, but he's a little bit funny with words. He varied the Béarnaise sauce circuit with trips to Carnegie Hall, also in black tie, to pick up medals, medallions, plaques, and illuminated scrolls, I don't even know what that is, before audiences too large to be crammed into even grand ballrooms. So many organizations wanted to hold dinners in his honor that 16 of them finally decided to combine. That affair, held in the Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center by the City Club, Park Association, Regional Plan Association, Architectural League of New York, Art Commission Associates, Central Park West and Columbus Avenue Association, Garden Club of America, Municipal Art Society, National Academy of Design, National Sculpture Society, New York chapters of the American Society of Architects, and the American Society of Landscape Architects, New York Society of Architects, Outdoor Cleanliness Association of New York, and the Fine Art Federation of New York. Whew, okay, that was notable for the fact that the guest of honor did not show up. He was in the midst of a particularly heated battle with LaGuardia at the time, and when he learned that the mayor had been invited to speak, refused to come. LaGuardia did, and devoted his speech to reminding the audience that the park department could not have achieved anything if it had not been for the sympathetic understanding and aid of the federal government. Never in the history of the world did a park commissioner have the amount of funds that have been made available to Mr. Moses. By the way, a little flashback for me personally. I recently read the Anthony Bourdain book, finally, and it was so good. It lived up to all the hype. But I think I'm like 80% sure that he worked at the Rainbow Room, which might have been this, or maybe it was just something related. If, with his deceptions and innuendos and breached promises, Robert Moses was seducing New York City into compliance with his desires, New York was loving every minute of the seduction and begging him for more. The media, whose amplification of his statements without analysis or correction played so vital a role in making the public susceptible to the blandishments of his policies, carried out the same effective, if unintentional, propaganda for his personality. Continually, in 5 or 6 part series or Sunday supplement feature stories or long interviews, it said he was totally honest and incorruptible, tireless in working 16 and 18-hour days for the public. And it allowed him to repeat or repeated itself the myths with which he had surrounded himself, that he was absolutely free of personal ambition or any desire for money or power, that he was motivated solely by the desire to serve the public, that despite unavoidable daily contact with politicians, he kept himself free from any contamination by the principles of politics. His flaws, reporters and editorialists made into virtues. His vituperation and personal attacks on anyone who dared oppose him were outspokenness. His refusal to obey the rules and regulations of the WPA or laws he had sworn to uphold was independence, and a refusal to let the public interest be hampered by red tape and bureaucrats. His disregard of the rights of individuals or groups who stood in the way of completion of his projects was refusal to let anything stand in the way of accomplishment for the public interest. If he insisted that he knew best what that interest was, they assured the public that was indeed the case. If there were larger disturbing implications in these flaws, they implied that he was above the law, that the end justifies the means, and that he should determine the end. They ignored these implications or joked about them. Columnist Westbrook Pelger dubbed Moses's technique of driving stakes without legal authorization and then defying anyone to do anything about them the oops, sorry technique. He's very move fast and break things. He would have loved Uber and Facebook. By the end of the 30s, praise of Moses was spreading across the country, fostered by the nationally circulated magazines published in New York. If it was possible to be more one-sidedly favorable to the park commissioner than the New York newspapers had been, the national magazines, whose readers were not interested in the details of local issues and who therefore provided the readers with only a broad outline of his career without any close examination of his methods, accomplished the trick. An article in Harper's began, "This is the story of the pride of a city. This is the story of the pride of a city in a man who brings beauty to a herded people," and ended, "New York presents an impressive exhibit of one citizen's building for the common good." In the 14 intervening pages, the reader was assured that Moses was interested only in the people's welfare, and that those who opposed him were obstructionists and politicians, and that his temper should therefore be excused. His rages are against those who would cheat the public interest, and that he was so absolutely honest and incorruptible that the laws which governed other public officials should not be applied to him in any case. Quote, this is a little quote from Harper's. Moses knows his way through the mazes of the law. On Flushing Meadow, he moved so swiftly that 600 odd... By the way, can I just tell you, I told this to my family, and I think it's so funny. Every time I hear about the neighborhood of Flushing Meadow, which is kind of out in Queens, I don't really go there that much, it reminds me of the scene from the Simpsons episode, and it's the kind of famous Simpsons because it heavily features the Twin Towers pre-9/11, where Homer... Well, the plot is that Homer... he's getting his car back, so he has to wait like for all of business hours, and he really has to pee, but he can't leave because he needs to make sure that he gets his car back, and he has to pee so badly, and then he sees a bus going to Flushing Meadows, and he's like, Flushing Meadows. Anyway, I told that to my mom and dad, and they bring it up all the time. They're always, they'll like call me and be like, "Are you going to Flushing Meadows soon?" Anyway, now you know. Okay, by May 15th, 1936, we're still in the quote from Harper's. Moses was in possession of the property, leaving it for the court to decide later how much would be paid. The city charter provides the contracts shall go to the lowest bidder. It hardly takes a hardy commissioner in New York to reject the low bidder. A commissioner against whom the charge of graft would not stick. The Board of Estimates swallowed hard and approved Moses' plan. The work of filling and grading was begun on schedule and finished on schedule at any hour of the day or night. Moses would appear to make sure that there was no delay. His only heartbreak was the fact that once every 24 hours, the machinery stopped 20 minutes for oiling. So that's the little Harper's quote. They love him. Did Moses feel that accomplishment was all that mattered, that the ends justified the means? Apparently, Harper's agreed. Those familiar with New York's ways would have prophesied that the 600-odd condemnation cases would keep the courts busy for years. But they would have reckoned without Moses, the article said. The docket was all cleared within 6 months. The article did not ask how the docket was cleared, or whether the rights of the 600-odd families being evicted from their homes were trampled in the rush. There was an overblown, romanticized quality to Harper's recounting the commissioner's life story. Oh boy, are you ready for a big, big, big block quote? I'm going to do it. I might kind of speed read. Oh, hello. I'm so glad. Thank you for saying this is cool. I'm not as good as the official audiobook, but I do have fun. Also, it's fun. I've gotten to meet some people, and they're here in the chat. Okay, this is the big quote from the Harper's story. At Yale, they remember Robert Moses for his victory over Coach Walter Camp and the football enthusiasts who thought to monopolize the athletic money. At Oxford, they still speak of the avid vigor with which he studied the ways of government. Take a salary, said Smith. No, said Moses. Moses looked upon the grass, and it was moth-eaten. moth-eaten. He bought fertilizer, and the soured acres turned green. He turned to the trees. With his own hands multiplied 70,000 times, he trimmed away the dead branches, cut out the rotten sides, fed the abused roots, watered and tended, and brought shade to the dusty people. He saw the streets filled with children, frantically seeking to make ballparks out of thoroughfares. "We must bring the playground within reach of the baby carriage pushers," said Moses. He searched the city for bits of land. It never occurred to him that he is noble. What are the mainsprings of this man's single-mindedness? Why does he drive himself and others in the public interest? Why does he forswear private gain for the public weal? Is it human sympathy which drives him? Is it a sense of the misery of all the millions who breathe tenement house air? He knows that men must live and their children should see the grass and sky, and he fights for the grass and sky with the devotion of an Amos. I don't really know what capital A Amos means there. Does anyone know? But wow, that was a very glowing profile in Harper's. Okay, now we're back to the non-quote section. And there was an overblown, romanticized quality to the prose in which that life story with its great battles, the Taylor estate fight against the selfish interests, the Triborough Bridge fight against the politicians, it was recounted in Time and the Saturday Evening Post and Current History with the title Moses, Idealist in Action, as well as an Architectural Forum, which named him its Man of the Month, and confessed that conferring another title on the man who probably holds as many important jobs as any other living American was preposterous, and that its title was particularly inappropriate. What month? It is a lean 30 days on the commissioner's calendar when he doesn't pop up with a new bridge or flock of playgrounds or 40 miles of parkways or a zoo or a proposed tunnel from New York to Brooklyn or a plan to reshape the Atlantic Ocean. And in Fortune, which said, other men have built parks and roads and bridges in states and cities other than New York. And there were all these things in New York before Robert Moses was born. But it is doubtful if any other man ever built so many of these things and on such a grand scale. And which added, after calculating that he had spent $552 million of the public funds, that his success in defeating opponents was due to his scrupulous and unquestioned honesty in money matters, and thus not only like a Boy Scout is Robert Moses, always prepared like Galahad, his strength is as the strength of 10 because his heart is pure. It was in the national magazines that Robert Moses was first dubbed the Master Builder and the Master Planner. If the city's press had made him a hero, the nation's magazines made him a folk hero, a figure larger than life, almost mythical, shrouded in the mist of his own legends, a Paul Bunyan of public works, a John Henry of highways, the man who, in the phrase dreamed up during his gubernatorial campaign by some obscure GOP phrasemaker, and now spread, complete with capitalization, across the country, gets things done. Capital G, capital T, capital D. I did not realize that started during his gubernatorial campaign. I missed it. As the publicity spread beyond New York, so did the cheering. Life was not all white suits and black ties. It was also academic gowns and mortarboards. It was during the 30s that Moses began to spend his Junes traveling to out-of-town colleges to receive honorary degrees. He would eventually become a doctor of laws 11 times over, a doctor of engineering 6 times, and a doctor of humane letters twice. I never wrote a humane letter in my life, he protested. Oh, he's so funny. As well as a bachelor and a master of arts, twice each, and a doctor of fine arts and of public administration, as well as philosophy. Park and horticultural associations all up and down the eastern seaboard began to give him awards. The Boston-based trustees of public reservations, for example, commended him for distinguished service in conservation. So fast did the awards flow, in fact, that he found if he traveled to each out-of-town event at which he was to receive one, he would have little time for work. He therefore made a practice of not attending and of reading his acceptance speech over the telephone on his desk, which was hooked up at the dais at the event to an amplifying device that enabled the audience to hear it. For a time, his wife and secretaries mounted the medals, medallions, plaques, and illuminated scrolls on the walls of his office, along with one memento that Moses insisted be placed in a prominent position, a memento that Fortune described as a letter of restrained commendation, dated 1930 and signed Franklin D. Roosevelt. The office walls soon were filled, and Mary Moses covered a long wall in the living room of their apartment with them. But they continued to pour in so fast that his secretaries finally just began storing them in packing cases. Yeah, Mary mentioned, this is exciting. All right, so Mary and the secretaries are putting the awards in packing cases. And what else have they been up to for the past decade? God only knows. Other cities began to send their planners and engineers to New York to see what all the fuss was about. Buses chartered by the park associations of Boston and Philadelphia brought matrons by the score to see the new playground design. And the response was invariably that of the 100 members of the American Shore and Beach Preservation Society, whose reaction followed a day-long tour of Moses's works, was summed up by a Herald Tribune reporter as amazed. Arriving back to City Hall after a similar tour, Mayor William B. Hartsfield of Atlanta asked a reporter, "Where does New York get all the millions to do this?" And then we have a little asterisk and then something on the bottom. Another reaction was voiced by a Latin American diplomat taken on a tour by LaGuardia himself. At each bridge and highway that the mayor pointed out to him, the visitor asked, "And who is in charge of giving the contracts?" Each time LaGuardia said, "I was." "Ah, LaGuardia," the diplomat said at last, with real admiration in his voice. "Ah, LaGuardia, you must be a very rich man." Oh, that's funny. I wish that were in it, not just a footnote. That's funny. Urban improvements on such a scale had never been seen before, maybe never even dreamed of. There were, for example, more miles of divided through highways uninterrupted by intersections at grade in the New York metropolitan area in 1940 than in the next 5 largest cities in the U.S., Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Cleveland, combined. Okay, most surprising thing about that to me, I think, is that Cleveland was in the top 6 largest cities. I knew Detroit was up there, but Cleveland is crazy. The architectural, I think I'm going to do like one more paragraph or so. Let's see. Well, I'm going to do one more paragraph. The Architectural Forum advised America's urban planners. If you are thinking of designing a system of parks and parkways for your own cities, you might as well go to New York for a few pointers. And in the forum concluded, while you're in New York, for best results, kidnap Robert Moses. A score of American cities tried to take the advice, at least on a part-time basis. Week after week, requests to lay out as a highly paid consultant, if he would not accept a full-time job, highway and park plans for cities large and small poured into 80 Center Street. During the 30s, he accepted one such commission to review plans for arterial highways for the Pittsburgh Regional Planning Association. He dispatched a team of aides to spend 2 months in Pittsburgh, reviewing their findings himself, and on the basis of their reports, submitted a plan laying out a comprehensive arterial highway program for the city. He had to refuse the others, but his mark was left on them too, for their engineers came to New York and spent weeks, in some cases months, watching Moses's men in action, and when they returned to their own cities, applied the principles Moses had taught them in building their own parks and roads. Nor was the cheering limited to America. Teams of park experts came to New York from countries all over Europe, even from Scandinavia, traditional leader in park design, and went home vastly impressed. As for roads, a survey of public works in America made for the British government by a team of British urban planners said, "The most important development in American city planning has in recent years been the building of express highways on a large scale. New York City has led the way in the development of an outstanding system of express highways and parkways. These are so good that it would seem almost essential that England should study them. It's probably the outstanding example of any democratic city planning in the world." Okay, I know I said I would read one more paragraph, but I think I'm going to read 2 more pages because that way I will be at the new chapter. And we haven't had a new chapter in forever. Truly forever. It's been like I think a 60-page chapter or something like that. In the years during which Americans wondered if Roosevelt would run for a 3rd term, there were so many media suggestions that Moses be the Republican nominee for presidency. Life selected him as the Republican to write the case against Roosevelt. The Saturday Evening Post commissioned him to give advice to my party. Moses never had any real chance of obtaining the presidential nomination, of course, but the frequent suggestions were a further indication of the extent of his popularity. Such popularity left little room for dissent. Yeah, they must have all forgotten that every time he opened his mouth, he lost 10,000 votes. Also, remember during his governor campaign where one of the radios, I can't remember exactly how it went down, but they had to get libel insurance if they aired his speeches. And so I think they might have either stopped airing his speeches or they had to get libel insurance. Not good. Not good. The press, which was turning him into a legend in his own time, had scant space to spare for critics. At the Hotel Pennsylvania dinner, at which he was deluged with a molasses Niagara of sweet praise, 100 pickets were marching outside the hotel protesting his treatment of WPA workers. But most of the city's newspapers never even mentioned them. The attitude of the press was reflected in the attitude of the public. At one Kiwanis Club luncheon, held in March 1934, the assembled Kiwanians applauded his speech, but during the question and answer period that under Kiwanian tradition followed the speech, one member of the audience said that he was disturbed by newspaper reports that Moses was intending to revoke all camping privileges at Orchard Beach immediately. As one of the campers at Orchard Beach, he said, "Will you grant us the privilege for a committee to interview you and put before you our story about the beach?" "No, sir," Moses replied, calmly and finally, according to the Herald Tribune. "The camps are coming down." The camper tried to protest the arbitrariness of the decision, but he was drowned out by the strains of the song sung by the rest of the audience to usher Moses out. For he's a jolly good fellow. Moses basked in his popularity. He wallowed in it. He boasted to his friends about it. And he felt it was no more than his due. He understood fully the importance of the press in creating it. In the introduction to the Park Department's 1940 brochure, 6 Years of Park Progress, he wrote, "We owe much to the press, without whose constant interest and publicity it would be impossible to explain our program and to obtain public support for it." But he had not the slightest doubt that the press's support for his policies would continue. Once, explaining his feeling that a controversial project could be pushed through the Board of Estimate, he ended a conversation with an objecting McGoldrick by saying dryly, "We'll undoubtedly have the cooperation of the press, you know." No matter how busy he was, Moses always tried to find time in the late afternoon to drop in on Al Smith. His old buddy. The former governor was a sad and bitter man now, long before his time. Retired from public life at the age of 56, too early for retirement for a man accustomed to action and applause and still healthy and strong, he had found in business only humiliation. He felt that all New York must know that he had to beg Frank Roosevelt for help to rescue the Empire State Building, and that even after Roosevelt had moved federal agencies into the skyscraper, it was still not earning enough to meet the mortgage payments, and they were being picked up almost as charity by John J. Raskob and the DuPonts. And Al Smith wasn't interested in business anyway. He was interested in helping people. With the Depression, people needed help, needed it desperately, and he wanted desperately to have a hand in bringing it to them. He was no businessman. He was the happy warrior of the political battlefield, and he yearned desperately, with all the desperation of a man who sees the sands of his life running low, to be part of that battlefield again before it was too late. As realization grew in him that Roosevelt would never allow him to play a part in the administration, that he was to be forever excluded from the public service in which he had spent his life by a man Smith felt owed him his career, he came to hate Roosevelt with a hatred so unreasoning and blind that it was all too easy for him to hate the things Roosevelt stood for. Okay, it's one more page from here. The old friends, the friends who would have made him see that the social welfare programs Roosevelt was espousing were only extensions of the social welfare programs he had espoused as governor, were gone. Mrs. Moskowitz was dead. Others were alive, but he didn't see much of them anymore. Their field was politics, and he was no longer part of politics. In their places had come new friends, the ultra-reactionary Raskob and William T. Kenney, who hated that man in the White House. And Al Smith had always been loyal to those who helped him, and these were the men helping him now. He had gotten his ideas from interactions with the ideas of associates, and these were the only associates left to him. These and Moses, who spent so much time with him, whom he respected so deeply, and who was as bitter about Roosevelt and the New Deal as any of them. There was no Mrs. M to counterbalance their arguments. It was as easy for Raskob and right-wing financier Jowett Schaus to use his bitterness for their own ends, to help him convince himself, as they were convinced, that the New Deal was communistic and Bolshevistic, that as spreading red-tinged bureaucracy was taking over America and destroying the principles that had made the country great. By 1936, the man who had once made being regular his first commandment was ready to try to split the Democratic Party by lending his name to the right-wing Raskob and DuPont Finance Liberty League, and by giving a speech, Moses played a key role in its drafting, assailing Roosevelt and warning that there can only be one capital, Washington or Moscow. Oh no, he's going totally this reminds me of Giuliani. As soon as he had given the speech, Smith knew that he had made a terrible mistake. But what hurt worse was the attitude of the public whose support he had once been so confident. The speech had caused a flurry in the press, but the flurry had been brief. Roosevelt had been able to laugh him off. The old governor knew he was still an immensely popular figure among New Yorkers. The drivers of the Fifth Avenue buses he took to get home every day recognized him, and on rainy days they would make a special stop in front of the awning at number 820 so that he could get out without getting wet. And other riders on the bus would stand and applaud the figure in the brown derby as he walked, somewhat stooped and stiff now, down the steps. But he was afraid that popularity no longer meant respect. When he got upstairs, his daughter, Emily Smith Warner, his confidant and friend, would be there. Her devotion to her father brightens the gloomy last pages of his life, and often so would other members of his family. But a family's devotion was no substitute for the roar of a cheering crowd or for a late afternoon in the executive chamber with a dozen associates helping him veto bills or waiting to see what the Republican legislative leaders up on the third floor were going to come up with so that he could draft the strategy that would confound them. He was a natural genius in the art of leading multitudes of men toward great goals, and he was being given no chance to use that genius. In the late afternoons when Moses came to Al Smith's apartment, he would often find the old governor sitting, alone except for Emily, in the darkened living room, sunk deep in an easy chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring in silence out at the sunset behind Central Park. One afternoon in 1938 or 39, Moses came in and began discussing some project. Emily cannot recall which one, that he was planning to propose, and Smith pointed out that there would be opposition. Emily recalls vividly Moses' reply. He would undoubtedly have the support of the press and of the public, he said, just as he always did. And Emily recalls vividly what her father said then. That's a slender reed to lean on, Bob, Alfred E. Smith said. A slender reed. He meant that it could break at any time, that you could lose the public support, Emily explains. Bob didn't say anything, but you could tell by looking at him that he was sure that he never would. The end of the chapter. Okay, next up, chapter 26, page 576, but I'm done for the day. Goodbye. Thanks for joining. I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll be more consistent. I was gone over the weekend, but I am back. Bye. Have a good week. Happy Monday. Yeah, wait, almost halfway. We might be halfway. I mean, maybe almost. Okay, let's see. Yeah, almost halfway. We're supposed to 1162. What's half of 1162? Yeah, we're like 3.5 pages away from being halfway. That's very exciting. Goodbye.